welcome IARIW to this wonderful conference centre in the centre of London for this conference, which I think is coming at a most important time for research on income and wealth. And I'm just going to be asked to say a few words at the beginning, and so I'll do so. My thesis is basically that economic statistics has had its day. We now need also to think about population and social statistics, which have also had their day. And we need to think instead about official statistics as a system. That's my thesis. I was going to start by talking about population. This is 3 population pyramids of the United Kingdom, which shows since 1966 through to 2066 that the United Kingdom is and will get bigger and older. But it will get bigger simply through migration. Now, I was going to talk about, I am still going to talk about this, but then I noted that the last conference of the IARIW was in Tokyo in May, and was about aging. And so I was absolutely inspired that IARIW were already on the game of my main thesis. But I wanted just to say a couple of words. Aging, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but migration is also incredibly important. And I would submit that the United Nations definition of migration is completely out of date, completely useless. It does not recognise what is going on in the world at the moment in any normal way. And if you think about wealth, then wealth is now much more because of migration and global phenomena. So you cannot think about someone being in the UK and that wealth being in the UK. I also would argue, I love Dennis Albert's work on remittances in the South Pacific, but I would argue remittances is the wrong word too. Wealth is the right word, but wealth, I would argue, is a global phenomenon, but I've only got a few minutes, so I won't talk any more about that. I will just make a point about aging. The left-hand side map, by the way, for colleagues not from the UK, these are maps of the UK, and they are divided by what we call local authorities. There's about 400 of them across the UK, and each colour on the left-hand side is demographic age. So on the left-hand side is the proportion in each local government region over the age of 65. And what you see, the darker the purple is the higher the proportion. What you see is a push towards the peripheries over time, south coast, out to Wales. By the way, this is Wales, if you didn't know. So out to Wales, and also to the beautiful places in the northwest of England and some Scotland. My point being very, very simple. That is demographic age. On the right-hand side is biological age, as measured here by healthy life expectancy. Here, the darker, the lower your healthy life expectancy. And between the poorest decile in our country and the richest decile, there is a 14-year gap. And I did want to make this point also about demographic age on the left. We're 98 years. 98 years since McKendrick's, I just love, I'm sure you've all read McKendrick's 26 paper. It is brilliant. And what, of course, it shows is that migrants are healthy. They go and they live, but we need to worry very much also about biological age, and we need to worry about biological age particularly because what we've been seeing, and thanks to Sumit for this slide, is a major increase in the UK over the period since the pandemic of the number of people inactive between the ages of 16 and 64. 500,000 extra people inactive between the ages of 50 and 64. That is a really big push, mainly due to ill health. There is also a bit of a problem amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. And again, thinking about demography, 18 to 24-year-olds, we have a demographic dividend in the UK at the moment. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the 47 huge cohort could be presenting an enormous opportunity to drive the economy of the UK for the next 30 or 40 years, but there is quite a degree of ill health, particularly mental ill health, particularly that amongst young women. So that potential scarring effect has an enormous challenge, but economic inactivity is a real worry, and that is my point about not only is geography important, geography amongst demographic and biological age, but also ill health. And also, we need to worry not only at a high level of distribution, but the distribution of income is massive in this country. So what we do here is go down to areas of about 400 households, and the distribution is huge. These are right across the whole area. I just showed you a quick picture for the centre of London. Here we are in Bush House, where it's not as rich as just down the road in the city. But because the darker the area, the richer it is. My point being the distribution is important. So my first point is geography matters. My second point is that age matters. My third point is that distribution matters. Why do I worry about distribution? I worry because we get so much of our work on income and on wealth from surveys. I've been doing surveys the whole of my life. I started doing surveys in the 1970s in the back streets of a city called Dundee, fearing for my life sometimes. It's a lovely place. If anyone's from Dundee, it's a lovely place. But what I've learned very, very, very quickly was that surveys don't always give you the full range of the distribution. And I worry greatly, personally, about losing those distributions. If we're worried about marginalized groups, even if we're worried about the very, very, very rich, it is very hard to get them. And the second problem we've got, the ONS, which I'm privileged to lead, has some of the very best, in fact, all of the very best interviewers in this country. And they're used over the years, to knocking on doors and people saying, you're an ONS interviewer, step right this way. Come in and have a cup of tea and we'll spend 45 minutes answering questions. That doesn't happen anything like the same way anymore. That's the response rates to our labour force survey over a period since the beginning of the year. I'm going to talk to Kevin later about whether you should make these sorts of surveys compulsory. The Australians know all about this kind of stuff. But my point is that globally, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, response rates are falling. The increase at the end is because we really threw the kitchen sink at getting those numbers up. So my thesis is, okay, what are you going to do about it? And I would argue that you need to do two things. Well, I would look, in the 5-day version of this talk, I will give many more versions, but the two really important things. The first is to reduce the amount we ask people to simply those things we can't get anywhere else, and thus enabling people to be answering questions when it suits them. If you can do it on your mobile phone, on the tube, on the way home, then that's got to be more efficient than expecting to be home at a time when an interviewer knocks on the door. And secondly, in order to be able to get the same amount of information, we've got to use big data better. So I'm going to finish this talk with 3 examples of big data that I think we should be using. But before I do that, just to say, the system, I would argue, needs the administrative data or the big data, because I'm going to show you some big data that isn't administrative data, linked to surveys. So linking is really super important. And look, when I first started linking data in the late 1990s, people said we were mad, we couldn't do it. Now you can do it on your iPhone, on Splink, without even trying. So we can link data, we should be linking data, doing so ethically and privacy enhanced and everything. And then we can use the administrative data outputs, the linked data outputs, and the survey data outputs as appropriate and bring them together in a coherent whole. And I would argue that's the future. What sort of big data am I talking about? This is one example, which is payroll employees that we get on a weekly basis, and I am absolutely aligned with the Chief Economist of the Office for National Statistics in that this should be where we start with income. So let's use these data as our starting point for income. Sure, you've got to get some extra stuff, but that's where we should be going. My second example is using card data, credit card data and debit card data. These I just love. I'm sorry for doing this. One of the most beautiful slides I've ever seen in my life. I got so happy when I saw this slide. So these two slides are about the beautiful. Well, I come from South Devon, which is here. So I always worry a bit about Cornwall because it's a bit further down and a bit strange down there. But it has a beautiful town called St. Ives. A beautiful town called St. Ives down here, right down in the periphery. This left-hand slide is where the good citizens of St. Ives, who have their credit cards registered in St. Ives, spend their money. They go on a big day's shopping to Plymouth, which is a big city. Well, down in the West Country, it's a big city. And they go up maybe and commute a little bit. We can learn a lot about commuting. On the right-hand side, remember it's a beautiful seaside town, people come from all over the country, is where the merchants of St. Ives are getting their spending from. In other words, if you're a merchant in St. Ives, people from all over the country are spending their money. So therefore, we learn more about income, we learn more about expenditure, we learn more about tourism, we learn more about commuting. I can do this for just gazillions and gazillions of towns. It has to be, I would submit, an opportunity in the future. And the last slide I just wanted to show you on big data is just rents. And this comes from the work that economic statistics in the ONS have been brilliantly doing, bringing private rent data into retail prices. And the point being, well, the 2 points I'd make. The first point is that there's 7 times difference in rents. The darker the blue, the higher the rent. I don't say any of that is surprising if you know the UK, but the point I would make is if you look at child poverty, without housing costs in London, then 17% of children are in poverty. If you add housing costs, it's 34%. That isn't the same in most other parts of the country, those green areas. It's about the differences are so different. So the difference in rents are incredibly important. And I thought I'd show you where we are again. And you can see pretty simply that the darker the area in Westminster, over there on the right-hand side, it costs a lot in rent. So what are my final messages? I've got 6 final messages. Number 1, I hope you would all agree, or we wouldn't be here, that timely, and this is critical, timely and granular economic data has never been needed greater. Absolutely critical. But timely is super important. There's not much point in knowing what was going on 2 years ago. It's really important for policymakers at a critical time. If nothing's happening in the economy, then it doesn't matter. But when things are moving really quickly, you need to know, and I think that's really important. Secondly, we need to have economic data alongside many other social data and have an official statistics system. Thirdly, as a statistician, I would say distributions are important, but they are. And I would argue that it's not just down to local, if you like, big local areas, small local areas are what matters. Big data have huge possibilities and we need to seize them. And so, my final message, and I really hope you have a great conference, and I'm going to hand straight over to Catherine, who's going to smoothly come in, is that we are, I would submit, at the moment for a bold economic digital transformation. Good luck with your conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Sir Ian. That's a great introduction to all the interesting topics we're going to delve into over the next week. My first job this morning is much simpler. I just would like to welcome you as President of the International Association for Research and Income and Wealth. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this 38th General Conference. We're delighted to partner with the UK Office for National Statistics and the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence for this event here in the magnificent city of London, or should I say Westminster, as Donald corrected me yesterday. We bring together world experts in the research and statistical communities to advance economic measurement. And looking at the recommendations that came out of Surian's topic, I think we're going to be addressing some of those this morning and what the subjects that we're going to be talking about. This year's conference offers a broad range of very interesting topics, from the implementation of emerging standards in the system of national accounts to the measurement of, to advancing the measurement of natural capital and the impacts of climate change, productivity and innovation, poverty, inequality, and economic security, and well-being for policy. And so I really sincerely look forward to engaging wholeheartedly with all of you in these important discussions in the coming days. I'd like to particularly welcome participants that are taking advantage of a bursary program from countries of limited statistical capacity from national statistics offices. So we're welcoming this year delegates from the Gambia, Somalia, Madagascar, and South Sudan. So please extend a warm welcome to these guests of ours. And lastly, I have a very important message for all of you. Some of you will be familiar with this process if you've been to these conferences before. But we have a tradition at the IARIW to solicit proposals for session topics from the delegates at the conference for the next general conference, which will be held in Belgium in 2 years from now. So we normally solicit these topics and we present and discuss them at the members meeting, which is going to happen tomorrow evening, so Wednesday evening. So I'd like to encourage you all to think about this and submit your session proposals to Andrew Sharp at the regular email info@iariw.org by noon tomorrow, so that he and his staff can compile them for discussion at the members meeting tomorrow evening. And I'm confident that we're going to have many brilliant proposals, and that we'll have just as interesting a program in 2 years' time as we are looking forward to this week. So without further ado, let's get started with that program. Thank you all very much.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name's Kevin Fox. I am an outgoing council member of the IARIW, and I'm a member of the executive leadership team of ESCoE. So welcome to all of you from me, from both of those capacities. Okay, we have a great program and a great way to start it off. We have Sir Robert Choate going to give us a keynote address. Sir Robert has had a very distinguished career, which includes appointments such as Director of the IFS, Institute for Fiscal Studies, and he was previously the Chair of the Office for Budget Responsibility. Now he's got an even more important role from the perspective of anyone interested in statistics, in that he is the Chair of the UK Statistics Authority. Please join me in welcoming Sir Robert to the stage.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin, and good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. On behalf of the UK Statistics Authority, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to London for what I'm sure are going to be a fascinating few days of discussion, as well as listening to and engaging with the excellent range of presenters and panelists on the agenda. I hope that you'll have time to catch up with old friends, make some new ones, and to see something of the city, and King's is a great base from which to do so. I think following from Ian's charts, so if you have time also to get to St Ives, which he showed there, where I came from yesterday on a very long, crowded train journey, then it's well worth the journey to do that too. For those of you who don't know, the Statistics Authority is the umbrella body that oversees the governance of the UK statistical system, and it spans the Office for National Statistics, our NSI, and the biggest producer of official statistics in the UK, the Government Statistical Service, and our Office for Statistics Regulation, which is responsible for setting, promoting, and policing our code of practice for official statistics. Before I begin my remarks proper, let me thank Rebecca Riley and her team at ESCoE who've organised this event on behalf of the ONS as this year's NSI sponsor. Rebecca and her colleagues have been working closely with Andrew Sharp, with Catherine and the IARIW team to ensure, I'm sure, that it will be a great success. As everyone here knows, this is a big year for economic measurement. In June, the complete draft of the proposed new revision of the System of National Accounts was released for consultation. Stakeholders have until the 9th of September to make their views known, and given that the draft weighs in at 1,000 pages, if you haven't started yet, you probably should do soon, having taken inspiration, I hope, from the conversations that you'll be having here this week. And once comments have been taken on board, the new SNA version should be signed off at the UN Statistical Commission in February. Now, I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow account of the many changes in the new revision. You don't have the time, and I certainly don't have the expertise. As chair of the authority, I was appointed to bring a user perspective to the governance of the UK statistical system as a former journalist, think tank director, IMF official, economic forecaster, and public finance watchdog. With Ian speaking before me and Richard Hayes on the panel to follow, I'm very much the non-technical filling in this rhetorical sandwich offered by the authority this morning, and they're the ones to pick up the difficult challenges. That said, I'm delighted that my more knowledgeable authority colleagues have made such a significant contribution to the proposed changes. The UK member of the editorial team, Sanjeev, is here this morning, I think. Yes, we do. He has laboured long and hard with the rest of the team, led by Peters Harper and Van der Ven, and is well placed to help with any questions you may have on the process or outcome, so do try to grab him during one of the coffee breaks. The SNA is a common framework and designed to facilitate international comparisons, but NSIs still have important decisions to take on whether and how its rules should be applied. To help do that in the UK, Ian, as National Statistician, can now draw on the wisdom of a dedicated committee for advice on standards for economic statistics, chaired by Martin Wheel. NSCASE is already playing a valuable role in ensuring that the international standards that we apply and the way we do so appropriately reflect the characteristics of the UK economy. As the SNA revisions near completion, it's tempting to think that the heavy lifting is over. But challenging and time-consuming as the conceptual and methodological work has been, there is a new phase of hard graft to come. Not just implementation, but disseminating and sharing the changes with user communities and helping them understand what the outputs do and don't mean and where they should or shouldn't be used in favour of alternative data. This will be important for a wide range of users, finance ministries, central banks, academics, the media, civil society and citizens. Communicating and winning confidence for this iteration of the SNA could be more challenging than for its predecessors, in part because methodologists and the more engaged users of national accounts had differing views about what it should be aiming for as the process began. Some arguably were largely comfortable with the current approach, which they saw as broadly fit for purpose, well understood, and by and large trusted. Others looked at the modern economy and modern society and saw a range of important issues where there was a need for new concepts, new definitions, and new data to help decision makers tackle new issues and to improve broader public awareness and understanding. Over the last 10 years, the editorial team and the wider ecosystem of task teams, experts and consultation respondents have forged a compromise between these views. In the end, I suspect that most practitioners and users in the UK national accounts community would probably have favoured a more ambitious set of revisions, but everyone recognises that a balance has had to be struck. And in part, that balancing act reflects the fact that some conceptually desirable reforms involve wider use of imputation and judgment, creating greater scope for less scrupulous national authorities to massage statistical outputs in convenient directions. And that understandably weighs more heavily as a consideration in some countries and with some institutions than others. Nonetheless, the version before us delivers valuable improvements to the national accounts to reflect the impact of globalisation and digitalisation, such as accounting for data as an asset, although deciding not to do the same for brands, and giving a clearer representation of that portion of natural capital which is already captured in the national accounts. Alongside these improvements, the UK's move from the European system of accounts to direct adherence to the SNA gives greater flexibility here to improve measurement of public services by allowing quality adjustment of output metrics. The Public Service Productivity Review, which Ian is leading, is developing potential improvements to the way we measure health, education and other services in ways that policymakers and others could use and understand. At the most recent meeting of national statisticians in Geneva, there was broad agreement on the need to think through input and output measurement in the public services, and I'm proud that Ian and colleagues are blazing a trail. Let me thank Deborah Presswood and Richard Hayes and their teams and partners across the Government Statistical Service for their contributions. You'll hear more about their work later this week, and I'd encourage anyone interested in the quality of public services measurement to talk to them and to get involved. From the maximalist pro-reform perspective, the new SNA has some shortcomings. It doesn't make radical changes to the core national accounts framework, such as integrating wider definitions of natural or human capital onto the balance sheet, tackling atmospheric degradation, or proposing formal methods to integrate well-being into new aggregates and metrics. Path dependence probably plays a role here. The earliest work on the national accounts began by focusing on flows rather than stocks, which is understandable given the circumstances of the time. Many countries in the late 1940s had seen their physical capital stocks devastated by war. Investment in human capital was relatively modest, with fewer than 5% attending university, for example, and natural capital was in great abundance, with the marginal cost of depleting these assets thought to be close to zero. But that mindset has held for the past 75 years, even as the economy, society, the environment, and the focus of policy has evolved. We're all aware of Thomas Piketty's work showcasing the importance and impact of capital in the modern economy. The new SNA makes some important changes here. I mentioned the recognition of data as an asset. But this is an area where there are big questions to answer, and the failure to bring human and natural capital more fully into the framework may be seen by some as a lost opportunity. We can see some of the challenges from the relative valuation of different forms of capital that emerges from the current version of the SNA, including its satellite accounts and the system of environmental economic accounting. Here in the UK, the national accounts capture £11 trillion worth of capital used in economic production. Natural capital is increasingly scarce, and society places growing value on ecosystems, biodiversity, and natural resources. But the economic exchange values or imputed equivalents that we use to value the UK's natural assets give it a value of only 1.7 trillion. Can it really be right that our headline estimate of the value of the environment in this country is only 1/6 that of its machines, roads, and buildings, when the former would be impossible to replace? One issue is that the £11 trillion figure for productive capital sweeps up £6 trillion of land and undoubtedly some of the value of ecosystems too. But the methods we use to calculate the value of these ecosystems and to impute market equivalent prices may also contribute to an undervaluation of natural capital. As the new SNA revision attempts to capture environmental depletion within net domestic product, the impact may become quickly apparent. Those arguing for or expecting more decisive changes might have expected estimates of economic growth to be reduced significantly as they're adjusted for the depreciation of natural assets, through environmental degradation. But any impact here looks likely to be relatively modest. For some vocal users, this will be seen not merely as an everyday concern about the accuracy of the figures, but a failure to address a fundamental unfitness for purpose. The treatment of natural capital will inevitably be a much debated area of revision. For example, should the measured stock of natural assets be capable of being enhanced, for example, by turning a brownfield site into a park or discovering some new mineral reserves? And should other enhancements, and should such enhancements in natural capital count towards GDP growth like other forms of investment? What value should we place on new natural capital, and how will we source data on both depletion and acquisitions? The ONS has participated in international discussion on this, but has yet to take a firm view. Conceptually, allowing natural capital to be enhanced would seem to make good sense, but the challenge is in sourcing data and prices. If the end result is a set of data which tells policymakers the environment is worth very little, policy decisions may reflect this, so bad implementation could be worse than no implementation. Turning from natural to human capital, the ONS's headline estimate of the value of the latter is currently £25 trillion. So we value humanity roughly 14 times more than we value the environment, whereas intuitively you might expect the valuations to be closer. Colleagues at the ONS are going to be presenting a paper in this area later in the week. Whatever the precise valuation, human capital should clearly be a major focus when thinking about the modern economy. As one of my colleagues has put it, trying to understand the UK economy without taking account of human capital is like trying to understand the Himalayas without taking account of the mountains. And yet, under the new revision, the SNA is not going to incorporate human capital into the core sequence of economic accounts. Within the current framework, that's entirely logical. Who has economic ownership of human capital, for example? But this means that the national accounts cannot help us consider key policy questions in a fully integrated way. Why does £100 million of spending on artificial intelligence count as investment when £100 million of spending on actual intelligence does not? And when we measure the economic output of the education system as the number of children educated, rather than considering, say, the rate of return on the qualifications they earn, we're surely missing something. Which is not to say, of course, that we should only consider the economic return to education. If Kuznets, Stone and Mead were in this room today and had the ability to start work afresh on the SNA, they might well start by producing a coherent conceptual framework capturing all forms of capital first and then build the rest of the accounts around it. Flows would remain a key part of the story, but we and users would not be focused quite as much on GDP, a partial flow measure that pays insufficient attention to the depreciation of these assets or to investments that might augment them. For all we might like or dislike about the upcoming revisions, they confront NSIs with two engagement and communication challenges. To explain the substantial changes that have been agreed to our users and how they affect and augment the figures that they're familiar with, but also to explain why some of these changes haven't gone further. Notwithstanding its limitations, we will need to introduce users to the concept of net domestic product, which does take account of the depreciation of natural capital and encourage them to make use of it. But we will still be producing gross domestic product with some changes, but fundamentally the aggregate that central banks, finance ministries and economic commentators are familiar with. And when their growth rates diverge significantly, that will need to be explained. We're a long way from being able to provide concrete details of the likely impact, but we do need to start to calibrate expectations. The GDP numbers may not move as users might expect or for the reasons they may presume. Changes to public sector output measures are potentially going to have greater impact on the growth rate of UK GDP than the proposed changes to the way we treat the environment, for example. How we manage this in the UK is important to the thinking of ONS and the UKSA. We have to balance being fit for purpose now and fit for the future. In today's constrained financial climate, we have to prioritise our core deliverables: GDP, employment, prices, population, migration and health data. But it's increasingly clear that new areas of statistics are going to be increasingly in demand. Well-being, the environment, crime, subnational data, household consumption, income and wealth, unpaid household work, labour accounts and human capital are all areas where we need new data that will lie outside the SNA, or at least the sequence of economic accounts. We need to continue to develop these complements to GDP to keep pace with changing user needs. being able to place these data alongside those generated under the SNA, such that valid and consistent comparisons can be made, is clearly going to require careful thought and methodological development, as well as resources. It's important to place this in the wider context of statistical demand and development. From the very top, the international direction of travel is clear. The data we produce are not enough. The UK Secretary-General's Our Common Agenda document called in 2022 for new complements to GDP to inform decision-making. September's UN Summit of the Future in New York will discuss the need for new measures at the highest political levels. The European Commission is considering sustainability and well-being metrics to support a new generation of policy making on the continent. The US is investing more in natural capital accounts. And our new Prime Minister here in the UK has stated that, and I quote, "With every pound spent on your behalf, we would expect the Treasury to weigh not just its effect on actual income, but also its effect on well-being." The mood music is clear. Key users want change, and the changes proposed in the new revision of the SNA won't yet fully meet their needs. In this context, it isn't realistic to see the system of national accounts as the answer to all questions. High-quality economic data will always be required, but they're not the only data that will be required, and the SNA shouldn't be expected to bear the burden of serving as the single source for well-being, sustainability, environmental or social data, particularly as so much good work has already been undertaken beyond it. In the 1993 and 2008 versions of the SNA, topics of new interest were increasingly brought into partial scope through satellite accounts. But the 2025 revision and the limitations it has to live with show that we may have run out of road in making the SNA carry the whole load. In the environmental space, the SEEA makes a bold start to share the burden, and under the Friends of the Chair of Social and Demographic Statistics, social statisticians are also discussing how to provide the complements the international community and domestic policymakers are seeking. Of course, that doesn't mean starting from scratch. In the UK, there's already been great work developing natural capital accounts. We've published a lot of insightful material on well-being, and we've created new methods for calculating inclusive income, aligned with the concept of inclusive wealth as recommended by the Dasgupta Review. We need to work with academics and colleagues from other NSIs to develop a coalition of the willing to move beyond the existing and forthcoming SNA frameworks. As those new concepts, methods, and statistics become more widespread and accepted, we can revisit the SNA framework and look to extend that work to other NSIs. I hope that in your discussions over the coming week, you'll not only celebrate and debate the 2025 SNA, but also ponder what we will need above and beyond it. I hope your sessions this week will bring innovation and bold ambition to these challenges, and I'm delighted to commend the conference agenda to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Robert. Really great talk to help us on our way through this conference. So many thanks to both our sirs here today, Sir Ian and Sir Robert. I think we should give them both another round of applause. Now we have a panel discussion. So Catherine, Martin, Richard, would you like to come up and take your seats? So the format of this panel session, just anywhere you like, folks. The format of this session is each of our panelists will talk for about 10 minutes. They have some slides, and at the end of their talks, we'll have a discussion, and there will be an interrogation of the panelists. And so please get your questions ready as they present their views through their slides. So the first speaker we have is the president of the IARIW, Catherine Van Rompuy. Catherine also, besides being president of this association, which I take to be the most important role she has, she's also chair of the Intersecretariat Working Group on National Accounts, and chair of the SNA Update Task Team for Wellbeing and Sustainability. and she also works at the World Bank when she's not otherwise engaged. We also have Martin Wheel here. He's the chair of the National Statisticians Committee for Advice on Standards for Economic Statistics, or I thought the IARIW was a rather awkward acronym, but this is NSCASE. And he's also here at King's College London. Then we have Richard Hayes. He's the Deputy Chief Economist at the ONS, and Sir Robert tells me that Richard will answer all the questions you wanted to ask of Sir Robert. So first up, Catherine, over to you.
Did you want some water? No, I'm fine.
We have to use this, I think, would. Okay.
Can I be heard okay through this mic here? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
No. You have to.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. Can my slides be loaded? I'm not quite sure how to. Okay. No, that's Richard.
Oh, that's not.
Oh, well, up. Sorry. Starting right. Reflections. There we go. Great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much after that very broad and interesting perspective from the UK on reflections on economic statistics and how the revised system of national accounts fits into it. I really feel as though I have my work cut out for me in this presentation, representing the system of national accounts update process. So maybe just to give you a little idea about where I'm coming from in this particular panel, many folks already know that I spent most of my career as a national accounts compiler at Statistics Canada, and I've recently moved to the World Bank, where I look after a small team that does a number of things. One of my favorite things that we do is that we participate in the governance and development and advancement of statistical standards on the system of national accounts. I'm kind of here today in my capacity as chair of the Intersecretariat Working Group on National Accounts, which is a collaborative arrangement, I'll get to that in a minute, among international organizations that are participating in that effort. So maybe just to start off with a little bit, my job today I think is really to tell you a little bit more about the process. I will try and give you a bit of a bird's eye view of what the changes are upcoming in the 2025 SNA to put things in context for participants in this room. But maybe just to start by talking about the governance of the SNA standards and how we actually manage the process of updating the standards. We have the Intersecretariat Working Group on National Accounts, the ISWGNA, which I referred to as before, which is actually a collaborative model that involves 5 international organizations: the United Nations, the OECD, the International Monetary Fund, Eurostat, and the World Bank. And actually, we have representatives in this room from many of those organizations that are also participating in this governance exercise and in this development of the new standards. That group is supported by an advisory expert group on national accounts, which is comprised of about 20 experts, so national accounts compilers from national statistical offices that represent different world regions. That is a primary advisory body that helps advise us on whether or not the standards are appropriate. Now, I am going to attempt to give you some kind of a flavor for what the changes are upcoming in the 2025 SNA. As has already been said, it is 1,000 pages. We do have, so I won't be able to go into detail on anything. I can just really maybe give you a little bit of an overview. But if you are interested in the details, which I'm sure some of you are, you can consult the United Nations webpage, which is towards the 2025 SNA, and the link is there. And you can find there all of the detailed guidance that was part of the discussion leading up to the development of the new standards. You can also find the most recent chapter drafts and the progress reports on the status. So I'd encourage you to look there for all the details, because I'm certainly not going to be able to go into that today. Now, the approach that we took for the development of the standards, and we all, I think, in this room understand that system of national accounts and other statistical standards determine how the economy is defined and measured, and they have to be updated periodically to ensure that they reflect the current economic reality. Now, our update, as has been mentioned, is well advanced, and it's targeted to come into effect in 2025. And the approach that we've taken has involved, which has been different than updates that have happened in the past, undertaking technical research on prioritized issues, and we started with 3: globalization, digitalization, and well-being and sustainability. Engaging in very broad consultation in the update, so we engaged countries and the research community in both the development of the standards and having broad consultation on whether or not they're viable and how they need to be improved. Our approach also aimed to ensure consistency, overall consistency with other statistical standards. So if we're talking about balance payments is one that I'll talk about in a minute, but government finance statistics and even environmental accounts. And we engaged in and continue to engage in a program of experimentation, testing, and advanced implementation to ensure that those standards are viable in a broad range of economic environments, in a broad range of institutional environments. So, and this is where it kind of comes back to this idea that when we're developing standards, there is a balance between conceptual purity and what we might like to see and feasibility in this broad range of standards, because our aim is always to develop a set of standards that will ensure international comparability. So we have to have confidence that robust estimates can be produced in a comparable way across many different types of countries. I won't spend too much time on this, but just to let you know a couple of other features of the update process. So we actually started back in March of, we started officially back in March 2020, but there was some work done before that, where the update process was launched by the United Nations Statistical Commission. Then throughout the period from 2020 to 2023, we developed guidance notes in dedicated task teams, which were put together for all of the various changes that we were considering. And as I mentioned, those involved countries, research experts, and also members of the Intersecretariat Working Group from the international organizations. Then we developed a set of recommendations which were adopted by the United Nations Statistical Commission in March of this year. And now we're in the process of really, but in that time we were also drafting the manual. And so during that time we were putting up draft chapters and annotated outlines, which were also subject to global consultation. So right now we're really at the final stages of looking for approval from the Advisory Expert Group and this other body that I told you about, the Intersecretariat Working Group on National Accounts, for the final manual. The draft manual has been sent out for global consultation, and we're aiming to have those recommendations adopted by the United Nations Statistical Council in March of 2025, to come into effect in 2025. Now, what you see on the bottom is that we designed this process this time to work in complete harmonization with a revision to the balance of payment standards. So all of the overlapping areas, sorry, I missed my little piece there, iterative drafting of the SNA among this period 2022 to 2024. So as I mentioned, we started with 3 priority areas for SNA: digitalization, well-being and sustainability, and globalization. But we ended up with a number of others that we're also looking at. And some of these overlap with the balance payments, which you see the joint priority areas in the middle square, and others are more distinct to either the national account standards or the balance of payment standards. The scope of the new system of national accounts recommendations include conceptual changes, but also a variety of different additional tables and statistics. And they also include, in some cases, clarification of the existing guidance where it was deemed that that was needed. So the clarification of the 2008 guidance. So I'm going to try and give you a very bird's-eye view of what these changes are according to the first 2 areas. I won't go into the clarification bit, but the first 2 areas, those that involve a conceptual change and those that are really about additional data that's created. And then I'm going to zero in on the proposals that are about well-being and sustainability, which speaks a lot to Sir Robert's comments on how we need to emphasize these things more and build extended aggregates. So the conceptual changes include, again, I won't go into too much detail, data as an asset, that was mentioned by Sir Robert already. Natural resource depletion as a cost of production, akin to the consumption of fixed capital. The sum of cost approach, consistency and application, a little technical, but essentially what that means is that we're building in a rate of return where we measure output on a cost basis, which is the case for government and public sector and nonprofit output, for example. Measuring the output of central banks, where we're building in a public good component, which has an impact on the gross domestic product and on the sequence of economic accounts. Renewable energy, recognizing the contribution of nature to energy production and things like hydroelectric, geothermal, et cetera, which will be extremely important for understanding the transition away from fossil fuels. And I'm proud to say that that bit was contributed by the World Bank, using the methodology from the Changing Wealth of Nations program. A split asset approach for natural capital or for natural resources that divides the returns to the asset into the asset itself and the returns to the asset into those that accrue to the extractor versus the owner. And then there are a whole lot of other changes, I won't list them, you can take a look at them, that don't have any impact on the key aggregates. And I guess maybe I should also just go back to when I talk about the depletion as a source of production, that is accompanied by what we would like to try and do is put more emphasis on net measures as a more appropriate measure. And there are some feasibility challenges in that for many countries in terms of the measurement of depreciation. Now, I think it was mentioned that we're not intending to include brand as an intangible asset in the S&A update. In fact, we did want to include marketing assets as investments, and that was originally part of our regular package of proposals. But as I mentioned, all of these proposals that we put forward, recommendations, they go through a global consultation process. And out of the full suite of proposals that we put forward through this process, that was the only one that was not supported. And it wasn't supported in the global consultations, not because of any arguments about that it was conceptually an asset, but because of concerns about the practical feasibility of measurement. It does remain on the S&A research agenda, and work continues with a dedicated implementation task team to bring that feasible measurement question forward in the hopes that in the future we will be able to include it in the standards. Additional statistics. Now here I'm just kind of giving you a very bird's-eye view of the ones outside of well-being and sustainability, because I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So in the case of globalization, we're looking at things like breakdowns of corporation into foreign-controlled, public, and national private, extended supply and use tables that get at global value chains and globalization in particular, and the treatment of special purpose entities, a refined treatment that better accounts for these entities. In digitalization, we're looking at things like improved visibility of the digital economy, digital supply and use tables, extensions for what we call free digital products. We all know they're not really free, they're funded by advertising, so we're kind of exchanging our advertising viewing services for these use of these products, like social media, email, etc. Crypto assets, that was one we had a lot of interesting conversations about how to best treat, but something that we certainly can't ignore moving forward in the future. So in the area of financial risks and vulnerabilities, we have built in new statistics on non-bank financial intermediation, which most people understand the word shadow banking, so non-regulated banking sector, financial derivatives, and whom-to-whom detail in wealth accounts that show a whole lot more detail on who's borrowing what from whom and who financial exposures. And other, I won't mention all these, but a whole lot of other areas where we're asking or we're recommending additional detail that will enhance understanding. So coming to the well-being and sustainability question, We have looked at this question, and I have the privilege of having worked very closely with Peter van de Ven and Jorrit Zwijnenberg, who are here in the audience, on first when I was in Statistics Canada and then at the World Bank, to try and develop a broadened and enhanced framework on well-being and sustainability that's appropriate to encompass within the system of national accounts. And we certainly don't pretend that we are encompassing everything that needs to be understood about well-being and sustainability within that system, but we are trying to improve the measurement within that system so that it can link to all of these other types of domains. So you can look at well-being and sustainability as being about sort of two distinct features. One being current well-being, which where we're looking at things like household income and consumption, labor, healthcare, education, and unpaid household service work, also very important. And future well-being, which we could also use the word sustainability writ large, not just talking about the environment, but in general, where we kind of emphasize a capital approach. And I think I might actually, yes, sorry, I have some additions here. So in our current well-being scheme, all of these things, we could recommend breakdowns into household groups, for example, income or wealth deciles or household composition. And we are, in fact, including that in the suite of recommendations that are in SNA 2025. And we can also include demographic characteristics, for example, gender, age, and education. And then the future, as I mentioned, well-being or sustainability piece really does emphasize the capital approach and does support compilation of inclusive or comprehensive wealth. Now, I think it was mentioned already that, for example, for human capital, we haven't brought that all the way through the sequence of accounts. There are many methodological and conceptual complexities to doing that we thought was beyond the scope of the exercise this time. Although there has been some important work done in satellite accounts in order to be able to do that. But we didn't feel that that was a realistic ask at this point until more work was done to refine those concepts and methods. However, we are recommending extensions on the wealth side, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Current well-being guidance, so a few more specifics. In the area of labor, we're recommending the inclusion of new labor tables as a standard component to the sequence of accounts. So these would be consistent with national accounts. In Canada, for example, we had something similar already where with our labor productivity program, we released estimates of output. We released outputs of employment, jobs, and employment characteristics that were consistent with the estimates that were in the gross domestic product. So new labor tables focusing on 4 dimensions: jobs, persons, the volume of labor, and payments, with a possible extension for unpaid household service work. In the area of the healthcare, we're looking at compiling regular compilation of supplementary information on healthcare expenditure with breakdowns by function, providers, and financing. Extension would also be possible here for unpaid household service work. Education, regular compilation of thematic tables on education and training, breakdowns of output and expenditure by purpose, provider, and financing, and including information on time spent on learning. And then coming back distinctly to unpaid household service work, our recommendations include compiling supplementary accounts on unpaid household service work at least every 5 years, which seems to be realistic for most jurisdictions. Extending supply and use tables in physical units and monetary terms, broken down by type of activity. Complementary extensions of gross domestic product and household disposable income that include unpaid household service work. We're not replacing the current formulation of the GDP and the HDI, but we are recommending the compilation of alternate measures. Additional information on a complete accounting of time use. Future well-being or sustainability. There is a number of proposals that we worked on, recommendations, that bring us in a more harmonized with the standards in the system of environmental and economic accounts. So in the system of national accounts, we're not trying to subsume the SIA, which is a companion set of standards, and we encourage the compilation of those types of accounts and the use of those accounts for extensions of SNA, but rather we're trying to make sure that these two sets of standards can speak to each other more effectively. So in natural capital, I already mentioned the inclusion of renewable energy resources. We have an improved treatment of biological resources. We have additional breakdowns for environmental related assets and flows to better distinguish natural assets. The split asset approach that I already mentioned, where when resource rents are split between a legal owner and an extractor, recording depletion as a standard component. In the SNA, emphasis on net measures. Clarification on the application, this is one of those clarification ones, on the application of net present value for valuing natural resources. Recommendations on how to treat emission trading schemes like carbon taxes or carbon trading schemes. And that was also a subject of great debate and discussion within the revision process. It was very difficult to standardize a treatment because of all the different models that are out there. Supplementary information on provisions, and we also encourage, I think I mentioned, the compilation of ecosystem accounts, which are obviously not covered by the System of National Accounts standards, but are covered by the companion standards in the System of Environmental and Economic Accounts. And I might just say we had a really excellent training session at the beginning of this pre-conference training session just before, on the weekend before the conference, where we had a number of participants, and we gave some training on both environmental economic accounting, focusing on ecosystem assets, which Carl Obst gave, and also on the traditional national accounting and talking about the new SNA, which Peter van de Ven kindly contributed in that. Just do a plug for our organization, the Intersecretariat Working Group of National Accounts sponsored that training. Human capital. So here we are relatively conservative in that we're recommending extended tables on human capital. And there are two evaluation approaches that are both recommended as possible. One is the lifetime earnings and the other is the cost approach. And in terms of social capital, we don't have anything in the SNA standards on social capital, but when we were framing this whole discussion around well-being and sustainability and the expanded capitals approach, we acknowledge that social capital is often referenced in relation to these extended wealth measures, but it's not proposed for inclusion due to a lack of consensus on definition and in particular how to value it in monetary terms. Distributions of household income, consumption, saving, and wealth. So I already kind of mentioned that in the initial slide when we talked about current well-being. And these distributions are relevant for both the current and future well-being or sustainability. So we are recommending regular compilation of household distributions consistent with national accounts, and we're talking about income, consumption, saving, and wealth. And the application of locally relevant socio-demographic breakdowns could be applied to other topics. So unpaid work, labor statistics, all of those kind of things. And I think we in our recommendations, we're not prescriptive about which breakdowns in terms of socio-demographic, simply because those will be those that are relevant locally. So if it's children in the UK and it's Indigenous people in Canada, those are going to be quite specific to local policy. In the new System of National Accounts manual, the SNA 2025, we have actually included a number of new chapters that give greater prominence to well-being and sustainability. So Chapter 2, which I might mention is right after Chapter 1, which is the introduction to the manual, really tries to put in context the significance and appropriate scope of well-being and sustainability in the System of National Accounts. So it talks about what an accounting framed set of standards can actually achieve in that space and how that connects to other types of well-being frameworks. So what are the limits and what are the advantages of having this accounting-based approach? Chapters 34 and 35 provide detailed specific guidance on well-being and on sustainability, respectively. And again, the emphasis on the sustainability piece is on the tie-ins with the System of Environmental Economic Accounts as companion standards that are harmonized where possible. So implementation challenges. And this was alluded to already, I think. For many countries, the full suite of well-being and sustainability recommendations is a daunting proposition. It will imply new investments in source data. So if we think about the full range of countries across the world, there are many that even struggle to adopt all of the recommendations in SNA 2008. And in fact, in countries with very limited capacity, some have not even yet moved to the 2008 standards. So when we were thinking about designing the well-being and sustainability piece, we had to think about it a little bit in terms of a modular approach. So understanding that countries will have to set priorities in terms of which ones are most important, which ones are fundable, et cetera. Even though we do understand very well that all of these would be relevant to, in any context, and even with countries of limited capacity, to understand the development path. But in terms of a practical reality, will they have the statistical capacity to produce that full suite? It's unlikely, and they will have to do it progressively. We also recognized that we needed to increase practical guidance to assist in implementation of these standards and to offer technical assistance or support for countries with limited statistical capacity. So my last slide, thanks for bearing with me, and this is very naive, so please just take it from a non-UK citizen and someone who's been participating in the development of the standards. But I am from a rather advanced statistical organization, Statistics Canada, where we had a lot of capacity and a lot of data and a lot of regional accounts and a lot of satellite accounts where we did a lot of extensions similar to the ones that are done in the UK. But it would be important to point out that the UK has a very advanced policy-driven program of measurement beyond GDP that really could serve as an example for other countries, and that many other countries have not been able to achieve the political momentum, the funding, et cetera. So it'd be great to learn from you and how you were able to create that demand and create that momentum in order to be able to produce that information. Any such program of measurement beyond GDP will be specific to local policy priorities and information needs. That probably goes without saying. And as I already mentioned, the SNA Global Consultations indicated that the full suite of well-being and sustainability recommendations are beyond the capacity of many countries. But the new guidance nonetheless provides the needed clarity for broadened economic measurement, drawing on these mature frameworks to assure international comparability. So thanks for bearing with me.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be able to offer a few thoughts this morning. Certainly what Sir Robert has said and what Catherine has said have been extremely comprehensive, but I'll do my best to add a few observations to that. So could I start perhaps by explaining what ESCoE is? Sir Ian did mention its existence. The key point I'd repeat is that since Brexit, the UK no longer has to follow Eurostat, although there are some residual obligations, but we can do our own thing statistically now. The National Statistician appointed an independent committee which began its work in July of 2022, and the committee advises which standards the UK should follow and thus whether the UK should adopt the 2025 SNA. Well, you might say, what alternative is there to the SNA? But of course, we've been following the ESA 2010 system, and a very practical, although not adopted alternative would have been to wait and see what emerged from the new ESA and then to follow that. Of course, the UK would have had no control over that process since Brexit, and the ESCoE recommended that instead the UK should adopt the 2025 SNA as its core reference framework. What sort of issues does ESCoE look at? Well, it's concerned about international comparability of any framework that's adopted, and it's also concerned about continuity over time. Now, of course, these may conflict. but certainly the NS case requires very good reasons for approaches that would deliver neither international comparability nor continuity over time where there are conflicts. What has NS case recommended? Well, you may remember that nearly 20 years ago, Sir Tony Atkinson ran a review of the measurement of public sector output in the national accounts. That recommended that quality adjustments should be adopted. The ESA adopted this rather peculiar position of wanting quality adjustments made in the private sector, but prohibiting them in the public sector. And the reasons for that weren't clear to me. Possibly they not appreciating the difference between constant and current price data, or chain-linked volume data and current price data, thought that individual countries might be adopting rather quality adjustments designed to obscure rather than inform. But anyway, the NS case has recommended that the UK public sector output volume measures should reflect quality change. Now, how to do that, of course, is a separate issue, and it opens up a lot of economic questions that will need to be addressed before implementation. Where has NSA recommended a departure from international standards? Well, what was certainly a departure from the old SNA, and my guesses will be from the new SNA, non-monetary gold. Who in the audience worries about non-monetary gold? And I think the answer is almost no one, except people from the United Kingdom, possibly Switzerland, and possibly South Africa. Transactions in non-monetary gold, when it changes ownership, appear as exports and imports. The gold never leaves London. You can get quite large transactions because gold is valuable in the short term, and NS case recommended that we should produce estimates of trade flows and thus of income and expenditure which aren't, contaminated by these issues. Now, we have heard from both Sir Robert and from Catherine about developments of the new SNA. What would I mention? Well, first of all, the treatment net of depreciation takes us back to the 1940 national accounts. From 1940 to 1943, I think, the national accounts were produced showing net national income as the final product. That was the sort of terminal statistic. And then, in 1944, they were integrated with Kuznets' framework for GDP, and net turned into gross and largely stayed as gross. Robert suggested that Stone and Mead would have been looking more at stocks and less at flows. Well, I had the great privilege of being supported in my early career by both Richard Stone and James Mead, and I remember Richard Stone saying very clearly, and perhaps slightly disapprovingly, that it was Keynes who wasn't interested in stocks. So perhaps that's where the flows came from, or why there was the focus on flows. We've heard about the focus on sustainability and well-being, and I must say, I think here this does give rise to the possibility of disappointment. There's no advice, as far as I know, on the production of a small number of aggregate indicators of well-being, but what users like are aggregates rather than statistics from which they can work out what they want. And or at least if they work out what they want, you run the risk that they may be rather selective and may not do it in a way that necessarily makes good economic sense. Distributional accounts, as well as not being accounts, really don't answer the question. But to give a good example, if you look at the growth in the geometric mean of household incomes and you deflate it by a deflator that my late colleague Zig Price developed in 1958, a democratic index of a democratic price index, then what do you get? The average of each household's income growth over the period in question, and that of course, is a statistic which is which reflects the distribution of income in a way that growth in average household income doesn't, and is quite easy to explain to the public. Of course, it's not linear, and how you address distributional issues in a linear framework, except by ending up with, say, deciles and saying to the users, do what you like with these, I'm not sure. Similarly, I think there was a missed opportunity in the definition of net national income, real net national income. The focus on net rather than gross, I think, makes a lot of sense. I prefer the 1940 to the 1944 framework, but people want to think in real terms. And the SNA here really does offer a sort of dog's breakfast of deflators. You deflate the trade balance by something, you deflate net income from abroad by something else, and what you end up with, I wouldn't like to have to try to explain to people. Marty Weitzman showed in 1976 that if you want an indicator of well-being, then you should deflate net national income by the consumption deflator. This, of course, means that you generate what I could call terms of trade effects from investment goods prices as well as from international trade prices. But the point is that if investment goods become cheaper in terms of consumption goods and capital markets are efficient, you should expect less from them in the future because you're having to give up less now to provide for them. And that's a framework which is easy to implement, can be explained in a few lines. It's internationally compatible. It resolves the issue of coherence between each country's terms of trade adjustment if you add up the measures of real national income or you produce chain-linked estimates across countries. So I really do think that that's something which at least it would be quite easy to put a reference into in the revision, because as Sir Robert said, it's not until the 9th of September that submissions are due, and I have already put in a submission saying that. The issue of sustainability, well, I would define sustainability with reference to net saving, the flow of net saving. If net saving is positive, future consumption should be expected to be larger than current consumption. If net saving is negative, the opposite is true. So that offers a fairly robust way of identifying sustainability. At least it does in principle, but the question that's raised, which we've skirted round so far this morning, is what is saving? And there's saving as national accountants define it. As Sir Robert mentioned, that doesn't include saving in education or in building up human capital, but of course there are depreciation issues with human capital. Some of us notice our human capital depreciating fairly rapidly. So you need to there very much to focus on net issues rather than gross issues, and simply to say gross saving is much bigger than we'd thought without taking account of capital consumption or depreciation would, I think, be rather damaging. So anyway, as I say, there's no advice on how to produce aggregates which are sensitive to the distribution of real income, and the obstacle may be that that's because non-linearities don't work terribly well in an accounting framework. It's not clear how measures of well-being will reflect the shadow price of free natural resources, but we're going to hear further thoughts on this at the conference. In response to a point about central banks shown on Catherine's slide, I do worry very much that the central bank is rolled up in financial institutions rather than, at least in the countries where the central bank is state-owned, being seen as a part of central government. Of course, until Britain became compliant with the current framework, we used to have a sort of compromise which may have confused everyone. The Bank of England used to be divided into an issue department which issued the banknotes and a banking department that did banking. The issue department was seen as part of central government. The banking department, it was believed, was like any other bank. I don't know that that's an argument anyone would support now, but the separation of the central bank from the rest of the things the government does, when actually it's quite core to maintaining the functioning of the economy, it's one of the main things that the government does. That does worry me, but whether I'll be able to produce coherent thoughts on that for the 9th of September, I'm really not sure. Anyway, certainly there's a lot more to think about. I think the SNA opens up a wide research program, but we should certainly thank the producers of the new SNA for taking us as far as they have. So anyway, with those thoughts, perhaps I should draw my comments to a close and we move over to Richard. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Richard Hayes. I'm Deputy Chief Economist at the ONS. And during COVID, my children developed a fun game. During the long months of me sitting in our lounge working on my computer. Oh. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me? Yep. They developed ONS Bingo. Effectively, they'd sit and they'd listen to me churning out these unusual phrases and words that they didn't really recognize. ESCoE, gold, deflators, Sanjeev, and regularly, tell me that they'd filled up the grid for the day and I'd covered all the key points. I mention that because very much sitting on the beach this summer looking at the thousands of pages of the SNA, which has been a joy, thank you, Peter, they started to develop a new game. While some chapters, as Catherine's identified, are entirely new and cover new material, the chapters on the core sequence of accounts actually change very little. And so their new game was spotting a track change, the word in red, the thing that was underlined, to say, oh, there's one. You've got one on this page, Dad. And increasingly, this got me thinking about the journey we have been on as a group over the last 30 years, the revisions in 1993, the revision in 2008, the revision that we're going through now. And essentially what we have looks to me, looking through that longer time period, to be a process of refinement, a process where actually what we have delivered and what is being delivered in the 2025 revision, in particular in relation to that core central sequence of accounts, is one where there is a consensus that has been developed through time, and the current revision is doing fine tweaks and revisions, refreshing certain points around that broad picture of consensus, and actually that the underlying framework within the SNA is now very stable, isn't materially changing. And that really what we have been finding ways to do during this revision is ways of accommodating new items into the landscape where new economic activity or forms of behavior have emerged, where we need to find a way of fitting it within a landscape which is broadly agreed. And I put this picture together simply because I think to a degree that process has been over time a balancing act, and one can see some of the drivers which underpin that. As Catherine mentioned, we know that not all countries in the same position have been able to move at the same pace. We know many countries in the global south are challenged in terms of finding the resources to move to 2008. There are one or two which still are working through that process and completing the process of moving to 1993, and therefore delivering fundamental reforms to the economic framework would be exceedingly challenging to them, and in effect force them to leap forward a generation or hopscotch over a whole manual. I think equally when one looks at this through time, the issues around human capital, which are ones which my team and I spend a lot of time thinking about, the data we have, even in the UK, even for countries which have been able to make that investment, don't go back to 1968, don't go back to the 1940s. And so being able to maintain a consistency through time and tell a story which actually works in that dimension, I think is vitally important as well, which has taken us to this position where this consensus around what fits within the SNA has formed. But that, I think, takes us to a question, which is if we have this consensus, and actually my children can play a game of going, look, there's a track change on this page, that's all that's happened on this page. We're at a point of such maturity that actually we have the opportunity, I think, now to look forward, and I'm not going to say much more about the 2025 SNA, I'm going to try and look a little bit beyond that to say, how do we do this in the future? Do we need generational once every 15-year updates where we throw all the balls in the air and they all land in basically essentially the same places that they were before? Or should we look to develop a process which is more nimble? I know the IMF, and we have some IMF colleagues I think here with us, have been starting to think about this in terms of if what we're doing actually is a process of accommodating new items within the existing framework, can we be far more nimble in doing that? Can we be doing that every 5 years or so and actually picking off one or two key pertinent issues which allow us to then move at a greater pace and react better to the policy needs of the day? So even in this morning session, we've discussed branding assets and the fact we continue to think about that. And indeed, as a country that has been publishing estimates of branding assets for the last 10 years, I probably have a little less sympathy for those who say that there are production challenges which can't be overcome. Crypto assets is one which very much has been in my mind as an area that I've been working on. We've got a model for taking crypto assets into the SNA, but we know regulators around the world are thinking about exactly how to treat these. They could come to different decisions, and when the economic reality of these assets change, we probably do need to come back and think about how we account for them. Those are nice examples where actually we don't want to be waiting 15 years. You don't want to be waiting for the UK to have 25 years worth of branding asset data before we're talking about how to bring it into the SNA. And so delivering this at pace seems to me to have potentially some real advantages. But I think the corollary there is that that leads us to a point where we need to be scoping the research agenda very, very carefully. We want to be bringing those items into the research agenda, which we can push through at pace, where there is an urgent need, where there's a rising policy issue. But equally, we know that the 2025 edition, the revision, was posed some really big questions in its mandate. How to deal with the environment, how to deal with well-being. These are not small questions. And the work that's been going on over the last decade or so to address these, which have found the limits, I think, of how far that consensus framework can be bent and adapted to accommodate these items, means it's probably worth being very realistic with our users where the limits of this framework are. That we can't keep promising wild and ambitious changes that incorporate the atmosphere or human capital if actually that so fundamentally bends the framework. We lose the global south, or we lose those time series that actually are hugely useful for policymakers. And so being realistic about the scope of that research agenda, I think, is something, as a community, we need to be very careful of defending a realistic boundary of what we should be realistic in expecting the SNA to tackle. And I think the point that Robert raised in relation to this is essential, that the SNA shouldn't be the answer to all statistical problems, which takes us effectively, I think, to Ian's point, that we need to be thinking about this in a way which encompasses the various different aspects of the statistical landscape. So if the SNA isn't going to significantly change, and we don't want it to be the answer to all of our statistical questions, those questions do need to go somewhere, and they do need to be properly tackled. And this is an area that I think the UN has recognized. At the last Statistical Commission, the social friends of the chair of demographic and social statistics, which, like NSCASE and IARIW, is a bit of a mouthful, have begun to look at the atomized system of guidance and manuals that exist in demographics, population, social statistics, and begun to ask themselves the questions of how to bring those items together in a way that marries up and can sit alongside the system of national accounts. Now, for various reasons, they start from a position of relative strength, having a lot of guidance which is out there, much of which does come from common historical roots and therefore shares enough common characteristics that this exercise is feasible but exceedingly large. There are tasks around agreeing age brackets and all sorts of details like that which need to be gone through. But I'm fairly positive that actually we are now starting to at least ask the right questions in that space about what the potential should be and how important should those statistics be vis-a-vis those that we publish under the SNA or the SEER, both of which are either mature or well on the process to maturing and delivering the type of infrastructure we need. At the middle of this little diagram, the UNSC also commissioned another new organisation that you probably won't be recognise, another long acronym, the UN Network of Economic Statisticians, UNES, to look at bringing together an expert group on well-being measurement, which can use the advances within the SNA as a really strong foundation point, base camp, to now push beyond that to say, how do we look at this data from the SNA, from the SEER, from whatever comes out of the social side? I've labelled it here an SPSS, but we're waiting to see what jargon they want, what long acronym they wish to take up. But how do we bring that data together into a framework which allows us to then look wider and have a framework for working out which questions go in the direction of the SNA or the SEER or the SPSS? Because at the centre of this, I would argue and have argued for a while that a framework for inclusive, sustainable well-being shouldn't be in the business of creating new data. The system should define the data that we create as a statistical system. The framework should help us to coordinate and navigate our way around that. So the expert group on well-being measurement is in the process of being set up. It was established earlier this year. So if you see me on my headphones at a laptop later in the conference, I'll probably be talking to someone about logistics on that. But I will probably pause. I think that's my last slide, yes. So I'm going to pause there and say, this is an opportunity for us to not just think about the 2025 SNA, but also to think about what we want to do going forward in this space and where we want the guardrails to be in terms of what should be in the scope of our research agenda in the future.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to all our panelists. We have some time for some questions, comments, complaints, expressions of outrage. Please put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question. We have microphones on either side that'll come to you, and please identify yourself for asking a question. Sanjeev.
I'll just speak now, given the time. I think there's some very good comments made here, and this is covering a very broad and wide range. Well done, thank you very much for that. And obviously from Catherine, you can see the SNA's covered a lot of ground. As I put it, Richard and Martin are covering various aspects of the dispute, disagreement, discussion, compromise, agreement, and whatever. So in terms of the breadth here and the future looking, one thing I would say, I've always said to people, there are differences in the international standards, which are right and have differences. There's different concepts and principles applied in the SEER as they are in the SNA, etc. And they can never supersede consistent, and we've gone along. But in terms of the way forward, I like Richard's description. So my simple question is to the panel: how and where do you think this work programme will go in the way forward? Because obviously someone's going to have to pick up these items and address them. What arena do you think this is going to materialise without the time scale?
Shall I have a first go? I'll have a first go at that. I think it's a really good question because I think we're at a point where we effectively are at a jumping off point on some of these options going forward. And therefore we need to have discussions not just around what exactly is in scope, but also questions of governance and arrangements. I mean, if you're thinking about well-being, and you look at the governance arrangements that Catherine described, you know, the ISWGNA is comprised of the big economic organisations which have primary knowledge around economic measurement and the right way to think about that. But you don't see the World Health Organization, you don't see the UN Environmental Programme, you don't see the World Wildlife Fund in that group. So if we're discussing issues which are wider, which bodies actually we need at the table, and how the UN, I presume the UN would be best placed to corral those and think about who is the right membership, I think is a really pertinent question. I think your first question in terms of where we've tried to find consistency and alignment wherever possible, I would agree with that, but of course the proof's in the pudding. It's only as countries are able to develop metrics, develop data, that you then begin to look at the numbers that come out, the formulas you're using, and begin to work out where efforts to be consistent may not have been wholly successful. And I think there is going to be a bit of a learning by doing journey that we'll all be on over the next few years as we put the new SNA metrics alongside the SEER, alongside traditional data from social statistics, and work out actually how they play nicely together in practice.
I must say I'd very much agree with that. The sort of problem that we face is that national accounts are produced at market prices. Market prices are relevant for many economic issues, but for a broader range of issues, they certainly aren't the only prices that you need to look at, and how we both establish and then manage these alternative pricing systems. Partha Dasgupta referred to accounting prices. I suppose I had found that a slightly unfortunate labelling, because accounting prices are things that I think of as accountants using. But anyway, we need a system which reflects the social costs of many of the, if you like, byproducts of human activity. And my sense is that the new SNA is really only beginning to address that. Catherine.
Thank you. I expect that some of my colleagues in the room would probably have a perspective on this as well, but in our early discussions of developing the well-being and sustainability proposals, I think we recognized immediately that the SNA was certainly not the answer to all questions related to well-being, and we even, I think, used the language material well-being as being, what we would be restricted to. But what we tried to do, and hopefully I illustrated that at least a little bit when I went through my presentation, was to be able to provide linkage points. So by introducing the distributions into the national accounts measures, by introducing breakdowns by demographics in labor statistics that are completely consistent with these macroeconomic figures, aggregates, then we allow for that linked analysis between other suitable frameworks. And we certainly didn't go into any or have any pretension to go into any subjective well-being type questions. We were only very focused on what connected to economic well-being, or material well-being might be a more appropriate term.
The questions? Yes, Paul. Oh.
Well, thank you. My name's Paul Eakins from University College London and ESCoE, and I'm a relative newcomer in the accounting fraternity and sorority, if I can call it that. but I'm an environmentalist, an environmental economist, and I'm not a newcomer to that set of issues. And I've thought for a long time about the kind of capitals framing and published a bit on that. And I very much welcome that emphasis that we heard from both Sir Robert and from several of our panelists. And I believe that is an interesting and useful way of approaching the topic of sustainability. My worry from the diagram that Richard showed, where we had these nice four interacting circles, if you like, is that what I'm beginning to see in the natural environment, a process which I'm afraid is going to get much worse, which is actually the depreciation of natural capital causing huge destruction of both human and physical capital. And we're beginning to see that increasingly with the climate issue, with heat stress, and with obviously flooding and other kinds of damage to physical capital. And I'm just wondering, as I try to work through for ESCoE how we try to capture water in the UK national accounts, which is not a subject that has had a lot of attention in the past, how we can make these connections between these different kinds of capitals when depreciation is a significant element of depreciation is going to be capital destruction from other forms of capital degradation. And I'm not sure that the way of capturing that, Richard, in your diagram there of keeping SEER, of which I'm a great enthusiast, in one corner, and SNA in another corner, is really going to help us and help policymakers make the connections between those issues, which are likely to be pretty important. So just some comments would be really helpful for me.
Very accepting of those comments. And yes, that diagram is a simplification to support a 5-minute talk. Very much data needs to flow around and between those three. And I think the outer three, social statistics, environmental and economic statistics, to support each, because there are undoubtedly feedback loops. Josh and I sat yesterday and had dinner and had a nice conversation about degradation of zinc cubes on the top of pylons in the West Country to show the impact of the Atlantic seas on rates of material depreciation for types of machinery in different parts of the UK. Now, that type of feedback of how data from the environmental side actually should be affecting the way we understand depreciation of a machine in Cornwall vis-a-vis East Anglia is actually an important economic question. And I think a lot of this ultimately will come back to where we, as a statistics community, want to spend the marginal pound, that actually we shouldn't be thinking about these in silos. They undoubtedly have crosswalks and connections between them. And that can justify us actually being far more inclusive in thinking about where we place any spare resources to maximize the output of the system.
Thanks. Might go to the next question. Is up there.
Lars Osberg, Dalhousie University. It would have helped me a lot in focusing on what people were saying, to have a greater specificity on what social problems we are collecting numbers to help solve. Because it seems to me that in general we collect numbers because we want to improve well-being, but we collect specific numbers because we think there are important social problems that are really important to solve in order to improve well-being. And back in the 1930s and the 1940s, there was a lot of consensus that mass unemployment was the big social problem of the 1930s, and winning the Second World War was the big social problem of the early 1940s. And in order to solve the problem of mass unemployment, keeping track of the total flow of marketed output is very important in how people can get paid jobs. And knowing how much you can tax and spend is very important to winning a war. And those issues, tax and spend and the provision of public services, and the maintenance of public employment, of adequate employment, remain hugely important. So the system of national accounts remains hugely important. But we're adding stuff because we think other problems are also becoming very important. And it was kind of implicit in a bunch of the comments that the environment was very important, but it wasn't all that explicit. And I think some greater explicitness about what exactly are the social problems that we are collecting specific numbers in order to help solve. I'm hoping for a response from the panel members to allow me to focus more exactly on just why we are collecting specific problems. Oh, okay, well, if I could give a quick thought on that. Are we making adequate provision for the future? No, we need to know whether we are making adequate provision for the future or not. If we don't make adequate provision for the future, there won't be a good future. We need statistics to know whether, not to say that no form of capital should be depreciated, but whether we're making up for the depreciation that happens in some areas and to some forms of capital by accumulation of other forms of capital. So there's a quick answer, and I think it's quite a big problem. Catherine.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to give you a bit of a non-committal statistician type answer to that question, and my answer is, I guess it's not really non-committal. It's really that I think our jobs, when we look at ourselves as, for example, I have a background of 30 years at a national statistical organization. And so what we're trying to do is to produce an information system that can meet multiple requirements. So if you're asking me sort of what social problems, well, when we look at the suite of proposals, for example, that are in the SNA update on well-being sustainability, we have additional detail on health. We have additional detail on education. We have new labor statistics, which could be used for a whole range of different types of analysis when you're breaking down by demographic group, et cetera. We have distributions that speaks to inequality and which groups and all of those kinds of things. Not just in the social scheme, but in the economic scheme, our challenge in the SNA update was to try and anticipate where things were going. So when we have new structures like digitalization and new data and crypto assets and emission trading schemes, which are nascent, but we know, are going to become extremely important, we have an obligation to build those in. So I guess it's hard to put your finger on one or even just a few issues that this system was designed to address. I guess maybe the social problems is a bigger question for if this network on social statistics takes off and builds a different type of information system that would create more coherent and integrated frameworks in that domain, which would again complement the SNA framework or be linkable to it, hopefully, then that would be a deeper question for that group.
I think this takes us back a little bit to some of the points I was raising about the need to be nimble and speed in developing our metrics. So thinking about the timeline over which this SNA revision has run, we're estimating within the SNA measures of material well-being, objective measures of units which drive well-being, at the same time that the science of subjective well-being measurement has taken really huge steps. One look at Sir Richard Layard's book from last year, and one can see there that in the time we've been thinking about the SNA, that's a science that's reached a relative degree of maturity that wasn't there when we began this process. And therefore, to a degree, a little bit of some of our ambiguity is sometimes because there's been a moving target. But now that we have the two sides of that conversation, measures and a methodology for subjective well-being measurement alongside the traditional objective measures of the key drivers, or what we presume are the key drivers of well-being, we can now look at the relationship between those and begin to ask ourselves a different class of question about diminishing marginal returns to income and how increasing income appears to increase subjective well-being until it reaches a level that it has less impact. Trying to understand some of those aspects in the well-being space inevitably then takes you back to needing to think about the impacts of the environment, those longer-term issues that Martin was talking about, and those social issues that Catherine was describing there. So I think it's always a problem when you're doing work and you're trying to react to someone on the other side of a frontier who maybe isn't at the same level of development. You're trying to second guess where they're going. And I think we're now probably reaching a point where actually there is that degree of catch-up happening, and then we're in a better position to try and tackle some of these questions.
Great, thanks very much. We're out of time, so we've got a break now. It's back in the exchange. If you need any guidance for getting back there, or any guidance or assistance at all while you're at this conference, just please see a member of the ESCoE team, easily identifiable by the lovely teal t-shirts they're wearing. Please join me in thanking again Sir Robert and all the panelists here.